The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished linoleum floor of Dr. Arthur Albright's veterinary clinic. He meticulously adjusted his spectacles, his gaze, though kind, carrying a weariness that decades of service had etched around his eyes. Mrs. Periwinkle, a woman whose diamonds sparkled more brightly than her affection for the portly bulldog panting on the examination table, was detailing the creature's latest culinary demands. "And he simply refuses the organic salmon now, Doctor. Only the wild caught, you understand." Dr. Arthur nodded, his hands gnarled but steady, gently examining Bartholomew the bulldog. "His heart sounds strong, Mrs. Periwinkle. Perhaps a little less of the wild caught and a bit more of a brisk walk," he suggested, his voice a low rumble, calm and authoritative. He had a way of delivering advice that brooked no argument, yet was never unkind. After Mrs. Periwinkle and Bartholomew, with his jewel-studded collar, had departed, an almost palpable silence descended upon the clinic. The scent of antiseptic and old leather, usually a comfort, today seemed to amplify the quiet. Dr. Arthur moved with an ingrained efficiency, sterilizing his instruments, the metallic clicks echoing slightly in the empty room. He paused by the window, looking out at the bustling street, a world teeming with connections that felt distant to him. His own clinic, a haven for animals, often felt like a solitary island. He ran a hand over a worn wooden frame on his desk, a faded photograph of a smiling woman and a small, laughing boy tucked inside, a silent testament to a warmth he hadn't felt in years. The routine of the day, the predictable ailments of well-fed pets usually provided a steady rhythm, but lately it felt more like a monotonous beat, leading nowhere new. He sighed softly, the sound lost in the quiet hum of the old refrigerator storing vaccines. Dr. Arthur methodically completed his end-of-day tasks. He switched off the bright examination lights, the room plunging into the softer glow of the emergency exit sign. The click of the lock on the front door echoed with a finality that settled heavily in the air. He walked through the silent waiting room, past the empty chairs that had, hours before, held anxious pet owners. His small apartment was above the clinic, a convenience that had once felt practical, but now merely shortened the transition from one quiet space to another. Upstairs, the routine was just as predictable. He prepared a simple meal, soup from a can, a piece of toast, eaten while standing at the kitchen counter, gazing absently at the cityscape beyond his window. The television flickered in the living room, news anchors discussing events that felt a world away from his own carefully constructed, quiet existence. There were no interruptions, no unexpected phone calls, no one to share the small details of his day with. He would later settle into his worn armchair, a veterinary journal open on his lap, though often his eyes would drift, unfocused, towards the mantelpiece where another, smaller copy of the same faded photograph from his office desk stood. The silence of his apartment was a familiar companion, one he neither fought nor particularly welcomed anymore. It simply was. He was a man of science, of tangible ailments and measurable cures, yet the ache of an old, unhealed wound in his own life remained, a dull throb beneath the surface of his orderly days. He often wondered, what's the biggest lesson your pet has ever taught you? Perhaps his had taught him about the profound silence left behind. Just as Dr. Arthur was about to turn off the kitchen light, a frantic, small knocking rattled the clinic's front door downstairs. It was insistent, desperate, not the polite tap of a scheduled appointment. He frowned. The clinic was clearly closed. He hesitated, a familiar weariness washing over him, but the knocking came again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a muffled, boyish voice calling out, "Please, is anyone there? Please, help!" Sighing, "Doctor." Arthur descended the stairs, his slippered feet quiet on the steps. He peered through the reinforced glass of the door. Standing on the darkened stoop was a small boy, no older than 10, his clothes frayed and too big for his thin frame. His face was smudged with dirt and tears, his eyes wide with a raw, pleading fear. Clutched tightly to his chest, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a small ginger cat. The animal was limp, its breathing shallow and ragged. Dr. Arthur unlocked the door. "We're closed, son," he began, his voice gruff from disuse, but the boy's desperate gaze stopped him. "Please, mister," the boy choked out, his voice trembling. "It's Whiskers. He's not moving much. I don't have any money, but he's all I've got. He's my best friend." The boy's small shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. his knuckles white as he gripped the bundle containing his precious companion. The sheer, unadulterated love pouring from the child towards the ailing creature was a palpable force, cutting through Dr. Arthur's practiced detachment. He looked from the boy's tear-streaked face to the still form of the cat, a small, fragile life held with such fierce devotion. The contrast to Mrs. Periwinkle and her pampered bulldog from earlier in the day was stark. This wasn't about organic salmon. This was about survival, about a bond that was clearly the boy's entire world. Doctor. Arthur's initial gruffness softened. He stepped back, holding the door wider. "All right, son, bring him in. Let's have a look." He flicked on the main lights of the examination room, the sudden brightness making the boy blink. "Place him here." Dr. Arthur gestured to the stainless steel table, his voice now gentle, professional. The boy, whose name Dr. Arthur would soon learn was Leo, carefully unwrapped the cat, his movements tender. Whiskers was a small, scrawny ginger tabby, his fur matted, his tiny body alarmingly still. Dr. Arthur's experienced hands immediately went to work, checking for a pulse, listening to the faint heartbeat with his stethoscope. "He's very weak," Dr. Arthur stated, his tone serious but not unkind. "He's dehydrated and has a high fever. How long has he been like this?" Leo sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Just since this morning, sir. He wouldn't eat, and then he just lay down." His voice cracked. "I found him in a box behind the bakery a few months ago. He's usually so playful." Dr. Arthur nodded, his mind already running through possible diagnoses. Pneumonia, perhaps, or a severe infection. He prepared a syringe with fluids. "We need to get some liquids into him and an antibiotic. It's like giving a plant water when its leaves are droopy. It helps perk them up. This will help fight off whatever is making him sick." He explained the procedure simply, seeing the fear in Leo's eyes. As he worked, he noticed the boy watching his every move, his gaze fixed on Whiskers, his small hand hovering near the cat's head, as if wanting to offer comfort but afraid to interfere. The depth of the boy's concern was a stark reminder that love and devotion weren't commodities bought with wealth. If the story of Whiskers has touched your heart too, leave a comment below telling us about your own four-legged companion. We'd love to read it. As Dr. Arthur gently palpated Whiskers' abdomen, checking for any tenderness or abnormalities, his fingers brushed against something small and hard, tangled in the matted fur around the cat's neck. He carefully parted the fur. It wasn't a tick or a burr. It was a tiny, tarnished silver locket no bigger than his thumbnail, shaped like a crescent moon. It was intricately engraved, though the details were obscured by grime and age. It was clearly old, and certainly not something a stray kitten would typically acquire. He paused, his brow furrowing. "Where did this come from, Leo?" he asked, holding the locket delicately between his thumb and forefinger. Leo peered closer, his eyes widening slightly. I don't know, sir. He's always had it ever since I found him. I tried to take it off once. Thought it might be bothering him, but it's on there pretty good. I just figured it was something his old owners left on him." Dr. Arthur turned the small locket over in his fingers. There was a tiny clasp, almost invisible. With a careful nudge from his thumbnail, it sprang open. Inside, protected by the silver casing, was a minuscule, faded photograph. It was a picture of a woman, her smile gentle, her eyes kind, and beside her a small boy with a mischievous grin. The image was time-worn, the colors muted, but the faces were distinct. Dr. Arthur's breath hitched. His hand, the one holding the locket, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. He felt a sudden, icy chill despite the warm room. The woman in the locket, she looked impossibly familiar. And the boy. He stared, his mind racing, trying to place the image, a forgotten memory clawing at the edges of his consciousness. He looked from the locket to the photograph on his desk, the one he glanced at every day. The woman in the locket bore a striking resemblance to the woman in his framed picture, his late wife Sarah. And the boy in the locket, it could almost be... No, it couldn't be. His son, Daniel, had been lost years ago, a tragedy that had hollowed out his world. This had to be a coincidence, a trick of the light, of grief playing on an old man's mind. Yet his heart hammered against his ribs. He stopped everything, the syringe with the remaining antibiotics resting on the steel tray, his focus entirely consumed by the tiny object in his hand. Dr. Arthur's mind reeled, a flood of dormant memories surging forth. The crescent moon locket. Sarah had owned one just like it. It was a gift from her grandmother, an heirloom. He remembered her wearing it, the cool silver against her skin, and the photograph. He'd taken a similar picture himself years ago, on a sunny afternoon in the park. Sarah laughing with little Daniel, then just 5 years old, pulling a face at the camera, his ginger hair a wild halo around his head, the same ginger hair as Whiskers. Leo, Dr. Arthur's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. This boy, in the picture, did anyone ever tell you who he was? Leo looked confused, shaking his head. No, sir. Like I said, Whiskers just had it. I never saw who was in it before. It was too small, and I couldn't get it open. Doctor. Arthur's gaze was fixed on the locket, then darted to Leo, then back to the frail cat on the table. A wild, improbable thought began to take root, a thought so overwhelming it made his hands shake more violently. He remembered the day Daniel and Sarah had gone on a trip to visit her sister upstate. There had been an accident, a terrible car crash on a winding country road. The authorities had told him. They had told him there were no survivors. He'd identified Sarah. But Daniel's body was never clearly out, they said. He had accepted it, buried his grief, built walls around his heart so high that nothing could penetrate them. But what if, by some miracle, Daniel had survived? What if, in the chaos, he had been lost, somehow separated? It seemed impossible, a fantasy born of decades of yearning. Yet the locket, Sarah's locket, was here, on a cat found by an orphan boy. He forced himself to focus on Whiskers, on the immediate task. The cat needed him, but the discovery had shaken him to his core. He administered the rest of the antibiotic and fluids, his movements almost automatic, his mind a whirlwind. He had to know more. This couldn't be a mere coincidence. The resemblance, the locket, the ginger cat, it was too much. He thought of all the stray animals he had treated, each a small life deserving of care. Animals, in their silent resilience, often mirror our own strength, our own capacity to endure. But this cat, this tiny, sick creature, might be a bridge to a past he thought was irrevocably lost. Whiskers will need to stay here overnight, Leo, Dr. Arthur said, his voice regaining some of its steadiness, though his mind was still reeling. He needs to be monitored. I'll keep him warm and comfortable. He gently placed Whiskers into a recovery cage lined with a soft towel, the cat barely stirring. Leo's face fell. Oh, but where will I sleep? The question, so simple, so innocent, underscored the boy's vulnerability. Dr. Arthur hadn't considered that. Where do you usually stay, son? He asked gently. Under the bridge by the old mill, mostly, Leo mumbled, looking at his worn shoes. Or sometimes in the doorway of the closed-down bookstore if it's raining really hard. Whiskers keeps me warm. The words hit Dr. Arthur harder than he expected. This child, who could potentially be connected to his lost son, was living on the streets. Tonight, Dr. Arthur said, making a decision that felt both impulsive and profoundly right. You'll stay here. I have a spare room upstairs. It's not much, but it's warm and safe. Leo's eyes widened. Really, sir? You mean it? Dr. Arthur nodded. While Leo ate a warm meal Dr. Arthur prepared, more substantial than soup and toast this time, the veterinarian made a few quiet phone calls. He started with the local police precinct in the area, where Sarah and Daniel's accident had occurred all those years ago. A long shot, he knew. He then called a contact he had at social services, a kind woman named Maria. He'd helped with stray animal cases from difficult homes. He described Leo, careful not to reveal his own burgeoning, fragile hope, but asking if there were any records of a young boy found around the time of the accident, perhaps with amnesia or unidentified. The initial responses were disheartening. Records were old, staff had changed, memories faded. The bureaucracy seemed an impenetrable wall, a stark antagonist to his urgent need for answers. Yet, Dr. Arthur persisted, driven by the image in the locket and the hopeful, trusting face of the boy now sleeping soundly in the spare room upstairs, a room that hadn't been used in years. He felt a stirring of purpose he hadn't experienced since before the accident, a sense that perhaps his solitary existence was about to be profoundly, irrevocably altered. If you believe that a small act of compassion can change the world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future stories. The next morning, after a restless night, Dr. Arthur checked on Whiskers. The cat was still weak, but his breathing was a little easier, and he'd taken a few sips of water. Leo was already awake, sitting quietly by the cage, his small hand resting on the wire mesh. "He looks a bit better, doesn't he, sir?" Leo asked, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "He does, son. He's a little fighter," Dr. Arthur replied, his gaze lingering on the boy. He still held the locket which he had cleaned carefully the night before, revealing the delicate engravings more clearly. It was undeniably Sarah's. He had to find out how it ended up on this cat, with this boy. Later that morning, Maria from Social Services called back. "Dr. Albright," she began, her voice tinged with curiosity, "your inquiry was unusual, but I did some digging in the archives. It's a long shot, but there was an unidentified boy, about 5 years old, found wandering near a highway rest stop about 50 miles from that crash site you mentioned. This was a few days after the accident. He was disoriented, couldn't remember his name, only that he had a cat named Moonbeam. He kept asking for Moonbeam." Dr. Arthur's heart leaped. Moonbeam. That was Daniel's nickname for the fluffy ginger kitten Sarah had brought home just weeks before the trip, a kitten Daniel had adored. "The boy had a head injury, nothing life-threatening, but it caused some memory loss," Maria continued. "He was eventually placed in the foster care system. He was a quiet child, very attached to a small stuffed ginger cat he was found with. The locket you described, it wasn't in his official intake belongings, but children sometimes hide precious things. He was moved around a few times, and eventually records show he ran away from a group home about a year ago. They listed him as Leo because he responded to it when a caregiver tried different names." Dr. Arthur listened, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles were white. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that was both joyous and heartbreaking. Daniel, his Daniel, had been alive all these years, lost, alone, but alive. And Whiskers. Whiskers wasn't just any cat. He was a descendant, perhaps, or a cat that reminded Leo of his lost Moonbeam, a living link to a past he couldn't consciously recall, but which his heart clearly remembered through his devotion to this small animal. The locket wasn't just on the cat was likely with the locket, a treasured possession passed down or kept safe. After thanking Maria, his voice thick with emotion, Dr. Arthur hung up the phone. He sat for a long moment, the weight of the revelation settling upon him. He looked at the locket, then at the photograph on his desk. The laughing boy in the old picture, his son, was the same boy whose eyes, filled with a child's innocent pain, had peered out from the locket. And that boy, now older, weathered by hardship but still possessing that same core of gentle spirit, was upstairs. Leo was Daniel, his son. He walked slowly to the examination room. Leo was still there, softly humming a tune to Whiskers, who had lifted his head and was watching the boy with weak but interested eyes. Dr. Arthur knelt beside Leo. "Leo," he began, his voice gentle, "can I show you something?" He held out the open locket. Leo looked at the tiny photograph inside. He frowned, then his eyes widened. He reached out a tentative finger and touched the image of the woman. "She looks nice," he whispered. Then he looked at the boy in the picture. "He looks a bit like me. When I was smaller, maybe." "Leo," Dr. Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly, "that woman, that was my wife, Sarah. And the boy is our son, Daniel. That locket belonged to her." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And Leo, I believe you are Daniel." Leo stared at him, his mouth slightly open. Confusion warred with a dawning understanding in his young eyes. "Me? Daniel?" He looked at the locket again, then back at Dr. Arthur. "But I don't remember." "I know, son. It was a long time ago. There was an accident," Dr. Arthur explained, his voice filled with a sorrow that was now tinged with an almost unbearable hope. "You were very young, but this locket and Whiskers, it's like they remembered for you. They brought you here." He reached out and gently placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "I'm your father, Daniel. I'm your father, and I've been looking for you for a very, very long time." Tears welled in Dr. Arthur's eyes, tears he hadn't shed in years, now flowing freely. This wasn't just an act of charity anymore. It was a reunion, a mending of a wound so deep he thought it would never heal. Leo, Daniel, stared at Dr. Arthur, tears now silently tracing paths down his own smudged cheeks. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze flicking between the locket, Dr. Arthur's tear-filled eyes, and the recovering Whiskers. Then, slowly, tentatively, he leaned forward and rested his head against Dr. Arthur's arm. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. A silent acknowledgement, a flicker of a long-buried connection re-emerging. Dr. Arthur gently put his arm around the boy, holding him close. The years of solitude, of quiet grief, seemed to melt away in that moment. The sterile scent of the clinic was suddenly infused with an unexpected warmth, a sense of belonging he thought he'd never feel again. Whiskers, as if sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, let out a soft, weak purr, the first sound other than pained breaths he'd made since arriving. The road ahead would have its challenges. There would be paperwork, adjustments, and the slow, careful process of rebuilding a life and a relationship fractured by tragedy and time. But for the first time in years, Dr. Arthur felt not just a professional responsibility, but a profound, personal joy. His act of kindness to a desperate boy and his sick cat had led him to an unimaginable gift, the return of his son. The true wealth he had been missing wasn't material. It was the richness of connection, of family, of love rediscovered in the most unexpected of places, brought to him by a little ginger cat and a tarnished silver locket. His clinic, once a symbol of his solitary competence, now felt like the heart of a new beginning. He looked at Daniel, his son, and knew that his life and his heart were no longer empty. How about sharing this video with a friend who loves animals as much as we do? Let's spread this chain of good. Days turned into weeks. Whiskers made a full recovery, his playful nature returning, his ginger fur now glossy under Daniel's devoted care. The small apartment above the clinic, once silent and echoing with Dr. Arthur's solitude, was now filled with the sounds of a boy's chatter, the occasional thud of a bouncing ball, and the happy purrs of a contented cat. Daniel slowly began to call Dr. Arthur Dad. Each time it sent a wave of warmth through the old veterinarian. The faded photograph on Dr. Arthur's desk no longer felt like a painful reminder of what was lost, but a beautiful testament to what had been found again. He learned that the true practice of healing extended far beyond mending broken bones or curing diseases in animals. It was about mending broken hearts and fractured lives, including his own. The connection he had forged with Daniel, catalyzed by a sick cat and a mother's enduring love captured in a tiny locket, was a second chance at fatherhood, at family, at a life filled with purpose and joy. He often looked at Daniel and Whiskers curled up together, a perfect picture of unconditional love, and knew that sometimes the greatest treasures are not sought, but find their way to you, often on the smallest, furriest feet. What was the biggest lesson your pet has ever taught you? Tell us in the comments below.